The courtroom fell silent until chaos exploded. Right in front of the judge, the mistress in a blazing red dress kicked the pregnant wife, sending her crashing to the floor as the millionaire laughed like it was a show. No one knew that the man holding the gavel, the very judge who just witnessed the cruelty, was the woman's long-lost father. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? The courthouse on Bull Street woke before the sun did. Fog rolled off the river, curling around the marble steps and the iron lamps that lined the square. Reporters gathered early, their breath clouding in the cool air as if the city itself were holding its breath. Savannah had seen its share of scandals, but never one like this. Never a woman brave enough to take Ethan Cole to court. Inside, the smell of polished oak and coffee hung in the hallway. Claire Whitmore pressed her hand against the small of her back, steadying herself before walking into the courtroom. The soft rustle of her beige coat brushed against the benches as she passed. At 6 months pregnant, she looked fragile, but there was a quiet strength in the way she lifted her chin. The reporters stopped whispering when she entered. Even the bailiff lowered his gaze. Ethan Cole stood near the defense table, the picture of confidence. His tailored gray suit caught the light. His smile could have sold forgiveness itself. Beside him, Vivian Chase, TV host and darling of Savannah's social pages, crossed one flawless leg over the other, her perfume drifting sharp and sweet. The two of them made an elegant pair, a portrait of wealth and charm that had fooled the city for years. Judge Robert Langford entered last. His black robe swayed as he took the bench, his expression unreadable. The murmur in the room quieted instantly. He was known for being fair, but distant. A man who'd spent decades burying personal feelings under the weight of the law. Yet when he looked up and saw Claire, something in his chest shifted. A strange familiarity he couldn't name pressed at him like an echo from a long-forgotten song. Mrs. Whitmore, the clerk, called, "Please take the stand." Her heels clicked softly on the tile. She raised her hand, swore the oath, and sat down, one hand resting protectively over her belly. The prosecutor began gently asking about the night she was forced from her home, about Ethan's threats to cut her off if she didn't sign the papers. Her voice trembled but never broke. "He said no one would believe me," she whispered, "and for a long time I didn't believe myself either." Across the room, Ethan smirked. Vivian leaned toward him and murmured something that made him chuckle. Claire's eyes glistened, but she looked straight at the judge, not at them. "I just want peace," she said quietly. "For me and for my child." Langford's pen paused mid-note. He studied her face, those gray eyes, the slope of her jaw, and his mind flickered back to a photograph tucked away in an old desk drawer. A younger woman with that same gaze. His pulse quickened. He forced himself to look down. "Focus, Robert," he told himself. "This is not the time for ghosts." Vivian was next to testify. Her heels clicked loudly as she strode to the stand, her confidence rehearsed for television. She painted herself as the victim, claiming Claire had faked injuries, exaggerated staged photos. Each word was laced with venom dressed in sweetness. "She's trying to ruin a good man," Vivian said, glancing toward Ethan for approval. "Some people don't know when to let go." A soft murmur spread through the room. Langford tapped his gavel once. "Control your tone, Ms. Chase." Vivian smiled, but her eyes flashed with contempt. "Of course, Your Honor." Claire sat silent, folding a tissue in her lap until it tore. She thought about this nights alone, the way the world had turned its face away. "Hold on," she told herself. "You have to hold on." Nurse Carol's words echoed in her memory. "You're stronger than you think, sugar." Outside, church bells began to chime the half hour. Inside, the air grew heavy. The prosecutor returned to question Ethan, who answered every accusation with that same calm arrogance. His lawyer objected, smiled, objected again. Vivian's laughter rippled like broken glass. Claire pressed her palms together, whispering a prayer no one could hear. Judge Langford watched her. He shouldn't have felt it, the tug of something personal, but he did. For the first time in years, the bench felt less like authority and more like a wall he couldn't climb. He cleared his throat. "We'll take a short recess," he said. His voice cracked slightly. No one noticed except Claire, who thought the judge's eyes looked almost kind. When they reconvened, tension crackled like static. The defense called Vivian back to the stand. Claire's lawyer began a quiet but firm cross-examination. The questions were simple, deliberate, pulling loose threads. Vivian's smile faltered. She gripped the railing. "You stated Mrs. Whitmore attacked you," the lawyer said, "yet no report was filed." Vivian's jaw tightened. I didn't think it was worth, and you were alone with her in the courtroom." "Yes. She was hysterical." "Who struck first?" "Ms. Chase." Vivian's breathing quickened. The cameras clicked again. The murmur swelled. She looked toward Ethan, desperate for reassurance, but he avoided her eyes. Her hand clenched, the tremor of fury visible now. And then, without warning, she rose from her chair. The courtroom froze as Vivian's voice turned sharp, her face flushing red. "You think you can humiliate me again?" she hissed, not to the lawyer but to Claire. The bailiff stepped forward, but too late. Vivian lunged her heel, catching on the step, and in one blind motion of rage she kicked. A sound escaped Claire, a soft, startled gasp, and then silence swallowed the room. The gavel struck once, twice, echoing like thunder against the marble walls. "Enough!" Judge Langford's voice broke the stillness. The entire room erupted, shouts, camera flashes, the rustle of uniforms as officers rushed in. Claire slumped forward, a trembling hand over her stomach, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Get her to Memorial Health now!" Langford commanded, his gavel slamming again. The bailiffs moved swiftly, escorting the medics as Ethan shouted her name more out of fear for his image than for her life. Reporters flooded toward the door, microphones waving like reeds in the wind. Vivian stood motionless, her face drained of color, her lipstick smeared as the realization hit her. I didn't mean," she whispered, her voice lost under the noise. A deputy took her arm gently, not unkindly. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." Langford rose from the bench, his black robe flowing like a shadow down the aisle. He stopped beside the stretcher where Claire lay pale and shaking, the smell of antiseptic and fear mingled in the air. "You'll be all right," he said quietly. Not as a judge, but as something else he couldn't yet admit. Claire tried to speak. "My baby, they're taking good care of you," he murmured. He wanted to say more, to confess the storm of memory rising inside him, but the words tangled in his throat. The medics hurried her through the double doors, and for a moment the judge saw the ghost of another woman in her place. Laura Whitmore, standing beneath the oak trees 30 years ago, smiling at him through sunlight and regret. The doors closed. Silence returned, broken only by the faint hum of the air vents. Langford turned back to the bench, but his hands trembled. He sat slowly, staring at the empty stand where Claire had been. The courtroom that had always felt like order now seemed haunted by something painfully human. Outside the courthouse steps were a blur of cameras and flashing lights. Savannah's afternoon sun broke through the fog, at last slicing across the crowd like revelation. Someone shouted, "She's being taken to Memorial." Another voice called out, "Vivian Chase arrested for assault." The sound rolled through the square, bouncing off the Spanish moss and red brick walls. Inside, Langford leaned back in his chair, pressing a palm to his temple. The gavel still lay on the bench, tilted slightly as if it too had lost its balance. He thought of the name Whitmore again, of a letter long buried in a drawer of choices that had led him here to this moment, to this woman he couldn't save without breaking every rule he'd ever sworn to keep. The bailiff approached quietly. "Your Honor, should I clear the room?" Langford nodded, but his voice barely carried. "Yes, clear it. And get me updates from the hospital." When the last person left, he stood by the window watching the police car pull away with its flashing lights. Beyond the chaos, the city looked the same, oak trees, swaying people, walking life continuing as if nothing had changed. Yet for him, everything had. He whispered to no one, "Laura, what have I done?" The sunlight slipped through the blinds, striping the courtroom floor with gold and shadow. And far away, sirens wailed, carrying Claire Whitmore toward the uncertain promise of survival. As the bailiffs rushed forward and chaos erupted, Judge Langford slammed his gavel, his voice shaking. "Get her to Memorial Health now." The rain had slowed to a whisper outside Memorial Health. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and clean linen. Claire Whitmore lay still beneath the white sheets, her pulse monitor blinking in a steady rhythm that felt almost too calm for what she'd been through. Night had come early, wrapping the window in gray reflections. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse laughed softly, and the sound seemed foreign, like it belonged to another world. Claire turned her head toward the window. The city lights shimmered faintly through the mist, and she thought of her mother, of the woman who had taught her to find beauty even in broken glass. Nurse Carol Jenkins entered quietly holding a small cup of warm cocoa. "Couldn't sleep, huh?" she asked, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had seen every kind of pain. Claire smiled weakly. "You can tell honey in this ward we always know." Carol set the cup on the tray beside her bed. "I brought you the real stuff, not that powder nonsense. Cocoa helps mend more than bones." "Thank you," Claire said softly. "You didn't have to." Carol pulled a chair closer. "Sweetheart, half of nursing's just doing what no one has to, but everyone should." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the hum of machines filling the space between words. Claire stared at her hands. The bruises had already begun to fade, but inside she still felt cracked like a glass, repaired with invisible glue. "Do you have anyone to call?" Carol asked gently. "Family, maybe?" Claire hesitated. "No one left," she said. "My mother passed when I was in college. She never talked much about family. It was always just us." Carol nodded knowingly. "Then she must have loved you fierce. Folks who've been through storms tend to hold tighter to the ones they've got." Claire managed a faint smile. She did. "She was the only one who made me feel enough." Carol reached out, giving her hand a light squeeze. "Then maybe she's still doing that wherever she is." Outside, thunder rolled again, low distant. Claire leaned back, the sound oddly comforting. "Sometimes I wonder if she'd be proud of me." Baby Carol said softly, "If she saw you fighting to live after what that man did, she'd be proud enough to light up the heavens." The words hit Claire like warmth in cold water. Her throat tightened. "You don't even know me." Carol smiled. "Don't have to. I've seen enough hearts to know when one's still beating for the right reasons." The monitor beeped steadily, a quiet proof of life. Claire looked toward the ceiling. "You ever feel like some people are just lost causes?" Carol chuckled, shaking her head. "Honey, the only lost cause is the one that quits looking for light, and you ain't done looking yet." Claire closed her eyes. "I wish I believed that." Carol rose and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. "You will. The truth has a funny way of finding us when we least expect it." She turned off the overhead light, leaving only the soft glow of the heart monitor. "Now try to rest. Savannah's got a way of making tomorrow look better than today." Claire smiled faintly. "Good night, Carol." "Good night, sweetheart." When the door clicked shut, the room felt both empty and safe. The rain started again, light against the window pane, and Claire let herself drift between waking and sleep. Somewhere in that quiet, she thought she heard her mother's voice, gentle, certain and near. "You're not alone, baby girl." And though she didn't understand why for the first time in months, Claire believed it might be true. Across town, the courthouse windows glowed faintly against the night. Judge Robert Langford sat alone in his office, his robe folded neatly on the chair beside him. The city outside was quiet, its rain-muted streets reflecting the gold streetlights like strands of liquid metal. A thin file lay open on his desk, Whitmore Clare. He had read it 3 times already, each word pressing deeper into him. The photographs were clinical printed evidence from the hearing gone wrong, but he couldn't stop looking at the face behind the bruises. There was something familiar there, a softness around the eyes, a tilt of the jaw. It stirred something, buried far beneath the judge's steady composure. He reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out an old photo, its edges worn. A young woman smiled back at him, Laura Miller. The woman he'd once loved and lost without explanation. He placed the photo beside the file and sat in silence. His reflection in the window looked older than he felt. "It can't be," he whispered. "After all these years." The clock ticked toward midnight. He folded the photo back into its envelope, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in decades, Robert Langford felt unsure of what justice really meant. He turned off the desk lamp, leaving the office in shadow. The rain outside had become a fine mist, softening the city's edges. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded, a lonely note carried through the night. As he gathered his coat, his eyes fell once more on the name on the file, Claire Whitmore. He spoke it under his breath, the syllables slow and reverent, as though he were saying a prayer he wasn't sure anyone could hear. He didn't know it yet, but that name would soon rewrite everything he thought he knew about guilt, forgiveness, and the meaning of family. Judge Robert Langford's house stood on Jones Street, where the cobblestones gleamed wet after the night's rain. The sun had barely lifted when he opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The city was quiet. The kind of soft, quiet Savannah knew best, broken only by the coo of doves and the rustle of Spanish moss in the oaks. He carried his coffee mug down to the end of the steps and looked toward Forsyth Park, its fountain catching the early light. He had lived in this house for 32 years. The garden still bloomed with his late wife's azaleas, though she had been gone for almost a decade. But this morning, for the first time in ages, the place felt foreign, haunted by the echo of a young woman's trembling voice from the courtroom. He went back inside, past shelves lined with old law books and framed commendations. On the desk lay the open notebook from the night before. His single line, "She knows," stared back at him like a verdict. Langford ran his hand over the page, tracing the indent of his pen strokes as if pressing them down could erase the truth. The doorbell rang. He froze, heart quickening, and for an instant he imagined Claire standing there. But when he opened the door, it was Linda Graves, his longtime friend and fellow attorney, holding a paper bag that smelled of warm pecans. "Good morning, Robert," she said, brushing the drizzle from her coat. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," he admitted. "Coffee?" "I brought my own," she said with a grin, stepping inside. She glanced around the study, her eyes falling on the clutter of papers and old photos scattered across his desk. You never wore one for tidiness when your conscience started stirring. Langford sighed. "I sent her an email." Linda paused mid-step. "You what I had to. After what happened in court, it was like seeing a ghost, Linda." Her eyes, Laura's eyes. Linda set down her coffee and looked at him, her tone soft but firm. "Robert, you realize what you've done? That girl's been through hell. The last thing she needs is confusion about who's who in her life." "I know," he said quietly. "But I also know I've spent 30 years hiding behind the law. Maybe it's time to face something I should have faced long ago." Linda studied him a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but if you're going to do this, you'd better be sure. DNA doesn't lie, but memories can." He gave a small, sad smile. "You sound like my conscience. I've been auditioning for the role for years." They shared a brief laugh that dissolved quickly into silence. Outside, the morning fog began to thin, revealing the canopy of oak swaying gently in the breeze. Langford reached for an envelope on his desk and opened it. Inside were yellowed clippings, old records from the courthouse archives, Laura Whitmore's death certificate, and a faded birth notice with no father listed. His hands trembled as he laid them out like evidence. "I found these in the archives last night," he said. "I checked the dates. Claire was born 8 months after Laura and I—" He trailed off. "Linda? I walked away when Laura begged me to. She thought my reputation would protect her if I stayed distant, but I never imagined she'd carry that alone." Linda touched his shoulder gently. "You did what you thought was right back then. We all did foolish things trying to be noble." He looked out the window again. A jogger passed by, and for a brief second he imagined Claire walking that same path, unaware of the man who watched from behind lace curtains. "Do you think she'll hate me?" he asked. Linda hesitated. "Maybe for a while. But hate doesn't last when truth comes carrying an apology." Langford exhaled the tension, leaving his shoulders for a moment. "I want to tell her everything, but not through screens or letters." "Then find a way to see her," Linda said. "Not as a judge, as a man who finally stopped hiding." He nodded, though the thought of facing Claire terrified him more than any courtroom. "You'll stand by me?" "Always," she said, picking up her bag. "I'll reach out to someone at Memorial Health quietly. If she's well enough, maybe she'll agree to talk." After she left, Langford stood alone in the study, the clock ticking softly behind him. He turned the photograph of Laura face down, unable to bear her gaze. Then he poured the last of his coffee into the sink and whispered to himself, "No more ghosts, Robert. Not this time." He gathered the letters, folded them neatly, and slid them into his coat pocket. Outside, the clouds began to part, letting sunlight spill through the moss. For the first time in years, he stepped off his porch without his judge's robe, just an old man in a gray sweater walking beneath the oaks, searching for redemption that had taken 30 years to find. By afternoon, the mist had lifted from the city, leaving the air cool and clear. Judge Langford sat in the corner booth of an old cafe on Whitaker Street, a place where no one thought to look for him. The waitress poured him another cup of black coffee and left a slice of pecan pie he hadn't ordered, the same slice he used to share with Laura on Sunday mornings. He smiled faintly, a ghost of memory crossing his face before fading again. Across the table sat Mark Delaney, an old colleague from the federal court days. Mark was a man who never missed a detail. He stirred sugar into his coffee before speaking. You asked for records on Ethan Cole. Mind telling me why Langford didn't answer right away? He traced the rim of his cup with a finger. Off the record, Mark. I'm not building a case, just understanding one. Mark raised an eyebrow. You always were cryptic. But since you asked yes, there's chatter about Cole's company. Fraud investigations, shell accounts, maybe even blackmail. Looks like your defendant's empire isn't as clean as he'd like the papers to say. Langford nodded. That's enough. Thank you. Mark leaned back, studying him. You're not yourself, Robert. Ever since that hearing, what's this really about? Langford met his gaze, the weight of 3 decades behind it. It's about a woman who trusted me once, and a child I never knew I had. Mark set down his spoon slowly. Well, damn. That's one kind of case the law can't help you with. Langford gave a tired smile. That's the truth. They sat in silence a while, the hum of conversation filling the space between them. Outside, Spanish moss waved like long fingers in the breeze. Savannah moved on with its quiet grace, oblivious to the turmoil in one of its oldest judges. When Mark left, Langford lingered at the table, listening to the faint sound of the cafe radio playing an old Sam Cooke tune. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the folded photo again. Laura laughing beside the fountain at Forsyth Park, her eyes full of sunlight and mischief. He remembered how she used to say, "You can't build a life on rules, Robert. People don't fit inside verdicts." He smiled bitterly. You were right again, Laura. That evening, back in his study, the judge sat by the window as the sunset painted the street orange. The phone on his desk rang a soft trill that startled him. He let it ring twice before answering. Judge Langford speaking. Robert, it's Linda. Her voice came through steady, reassuring. I talked to a nurse at Memorial. Claire's stable. She's recovering faster than they expected. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Thank God. She doesn't know you called. I told Carol Jenkins, she's the nurse taking care of her, that a family friend might stop by tomorrow. A pause. You think she'll agree to see me? I think she's wondering who you really are, Linda said gently, and you'll never forgive yourself if you let that question go unanswered. After they hung up, Langford sat in silence. The house was quiet except for the distant rumble of traffic and the creak of the old floorboards beneath his chair. He poured a small drink, held it in his hand without tasting it. He wasn't sure whether to pray or prepare. He rose and walked to the mantel. On it stood a photo of his wife Catherine, taken just before her passing. You always said my heart had too many locked rooms, he murmured. Maybe it's time to open one. He turned off the lights and let the twilight fill the room. The oaks outside swayed, their shadows dancing across the curtains like slow-moving ghosts. Somewhere a church bell rang 6 times, steady and solemn. Langford watched the last sliver of daylight fade, a promise forming quietly in his mind. Tomorrow I'll see her. Not as a judge, but as her father. He didn't know what words he would find, only that silence had lasted long enough. As night settled over Savannah, a breeze carried the scent of rain and magnolias through the window. Langford stood there a while longer, listening to the city breathe, an old man waiting beneath the oaks, ready at last to face his ghosts. The late afternoon light slanted through the blinds of Linda Graves's small law office, striping the oak desk in alternating bars of gold and shadow. Dust motes floated in the air, caught in that fading light, as though time itself had slowed to watch. Claire sat across from Linda, hands folded, a pale calm masking the tension underneath. The lawyer's desk was stacked with files, coffee-stained folders, and an aging brass lamp that hummed faintly. Thank you for coming, Claire. Linda said, her voice both warm and deliberate. I know it's been a long few weeks since the hearing. Claire nodded. Longer than I care to count. Linda hesitated before sliding a small envelope across the desk. Its edges were yellowed, its seal long broken. This was found among your mother's papers. It's addressed to her but never sent. The handwriting, she paused, eyes softening, is someone you might want to know about. Claire frowned, fingertips brushing the old paper. What is this? Read it when you're ready, Linda said quietly. It explains more than I ever could. For a long moment, Claire didn't move. The envelope felt strangely heavy in her hand, as if it carried more than ink and memory. She slipped it into her purse without opening it. Was it from her family? Linda shook her head. No, Claire. From a man named Robert Langford. The name struck something inside her, familiar yet hollow. The judge. Linda nodded slowly. Yes, he knew your mother once, before she met your father. Claire stared at her heartbeat quickening. I don't understand. You will, Linda said. Just read the letter when you're ready. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window pane. Claire looked down at the envelope again. It bore a date from 28 years ago and two initials beneath the flap, RL. She rose from the chair, the floor creaking under her weight. I think I'll take a walk. Forsyth Park's quiet this time of day, Linda offered. Might help you think. Claire nodded absently and stepped outside, the late light spilling over the rooftops like liquid copper. She didn't open the letter, not yet. Some truths had to be faced when the heart was still enough to bear them. The park was nearly empty when she arrived. Spanish moss hung low over the benches, brushing her shoulder as she walked the path toward the fountain. The water sparkled in the last trace of sunlight, scattering light like shards of glass. She sat on the cold stone edge and finally drew the envelope from her purse. The paper crackled softly as she unfolded the single page inside. The ink had faded to a gentle brown, but the words were still clear, measured, elegant, and filled with hesitation. Laura, I have no right to ask forgiveness, nor do I expect to receive it. I know the choice I made all those years ago took more from you than I can ever repay. You told me you were expecting, and I did what cowards do. I hid behind the law, behind duty, behind everything but love. If the child lives, please tell her. She was never unwanted. I've carried her name in my prayers for years. Should she ever come looking, tell her I was wrong to let fear dictate what love began. R.L. Claire's breath caught halfway through. Her eyes blurred and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. The letter slipped from her fingers and landed on the damp grass. The world seemed to tilt, the distant sound of the fountain rising and falling like a heartbeat. She stared at the initials again, R.L. And the truth struck her with the weight of a lifetime. Judge Robert Langford wasn't just the man who presided over her case. He was her father. She sat frozen, unable to cry, unable even to move. The air around her shimmered faintly as the sun dropped below the trees. Somewhere a church bell rang slow and mournful, and it felt as if it were tolling for all the lost years between them. Claire finally picked up the letter, smoothing the creases with shaking fingers. A few tears fell, darkening the ink. I don't even know you, she whispered, but you knew me. A soft breeze passed through the park, lifting the edges of the page, and for a fleeting instant she thought she smelled her mother's perfume, jasmine and rain. When she looked up, the lamplights along the path flickered on one by one. The city exhaled, and though her world had just changed forever, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in years, an opening quiet and deep where forgiveness might one day live. Morning unfurled gently over Savannah, draping the courthouse in ribbons of pale gold. The marble corridors echoed with Heel's whispers and the rustle of paper, a rhythm Claire Whitmore knew too well by now. But today she wasn't a plaintiff or a victim. She was a daughter who'd read a letter that refused to stop echoing in her chest. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain. Outside, the square shimmered with dew, magnolia blossoms nodding in the early light. Claire stood before the heavy wooden door marked Judge Robert Langford, her hand hovering above the brass handle. Her heart thudded once hard. Every instinct told her to turn around, to run back to the quiet safety of the unknown. But she didn't. She pressed her palm to the cool metal and pushed. The young clerk at the desk looked up, startled. Miss Whitmore. Yes, Claire said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. I need to speak with Judge Langford. Please tell him it's important. The clerk hesitated. He's between sessions, but I'll check. Claire waited, her fingers tracing the strap of her purse where the letter rested like a small heartbeat. A moment later, the clerk returned. He'll see you now. When she entered the office, Robert Langford was standing by the window, half turned toward the morning light. He looked older than he had in court, smaller somehow, stripped of the authority that once filled the room around him. The sound of the door closing drew him around, and when their eyes met, both froze. Miss Whitmore, he said at last, voice low and uncertain. I didn't expect. That's what everyone says, she replied softly. Her tone wasn't cruel, just tired. No one ever expects me. He swallowed, motioning toward the chair opposite his desk. Please. She sat. The chair creaked under her weight, the silence between them thick enough to choke on. The room smelled of old books and lemon polish. On the wall hung degrees commendations and a photograph of a younger Langford shaking hands with a senator. All the tokens of a man the world had trusted. Claire placed the folded letter on the desk between them. His eyes fell on it immediately. The color drained from his face. "You've read it," he murmured. "Yes," she said. "Every word." He nodded slowly, his hands clasped before him. "Then I owe you more than explanations." She tilted her head. "Try me." He drew a long, shaky breath. "Your mother and I met when I was still clerking for the district court in Charleston. She was the brightest thing I'd ever seen, but I was engaged to a senator's daughter, and ambition is a quiet poison, Miss Whitmore. It convinces you to call cowardice duty." Claire said nothing. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the silence like water dripping into a well. "When your mother told me she was expecting, I panicked," he continued. "I thought I was protecting her. I told myself that walking away would spare her the scrutiny, but I wasn't sparing her anything I was hiding. And you went on with your life," she said, voice trembling but steady. "You built a career, sat in judgment over others." He flinched at that. "Yes," he said quietly, "and every verdict I've given since has been my penance." Claire looked at him for a long time. His face was lined, his shoulders slightly stooped. The robe of authority was gone. What remained was a man stripped bare before the truth. "You say you thought you were protecting her," she whispered, "but you never came back to see if she survived it." He closed his eyes. "No, and I will carry that until I die." She leaned forward, her hands tightening on the letter. "Do you know what it's like to grow up believing your father was just a blank space? A story too painful for anyone to finish?" His voice broke. "Yes, I know now." Outside, a church bell struck 10. The sound cut through the stillness, deep and resonant. Claire rose slowly. "I didn't come here for apologies," she said. "I came here to look you in the eye, to see if the man from that letter still existed." He knotted his throat tight. "And do you—" She looked at him for a moment longer. "I'm not sure yet." When she stepped into the courthouse courtyard, the sunlight had grown stronger, stretching the shadows of the oaks across the flagstones. She paused at the fountain, letting the spray cool her face. The letter felt lighter now, tucked inside her purse like a secret that no longer owned her. Behind her, the door creaked open. She turned to see Judge Langford standing there, coat over one arm, uncertainty in his eyes. "Miss Whitmore." "Claire, wait." She froze, not at the sound of her name, but at the way he said it. Not as a title or a formality, just a name plain and fragile. He approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But if you'll allow it, I'd like to know you. Not as a judge, not as a stranger, just as the man who should have been there." The words hung between them like prayer. Claire looked up at the courthouse's stone facade, the same building where she had once testified, trembling and small. Now, she stood in the same place but taller, anchored by something she hadn't had before, the truth. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. "Not yet. I wouldn't ask you to," he answered. "Forgiveness isn't a verdict. It's a sentence we both have to serve." For the first time, she almost smiled. "You really can't stop talking like a judge, can you?" His lips curved slightly. "Old habits." A breeze swept through the courtyard, scattering magnolia petals around their feet. Claire's eyes softened. "There's a service tonight," she said, "at St. Andrew's. My mother used to light a candle there every Thursday evening. I'll be going." Langford hesitated. "You'd want me there?" "I'm not sure what I want," she admitted. "But maybe showing up is a start." He nodded, emotion tightening his voice. "Then I'll be there." She turned to leave but stopped halfway across the courtyard. "You know," she said over her shoulder, "she never said a bad word about you, not once. Maybe that's what real love looks like, protecting someone's name even when they don't deserve it." He bowed his head. "Then she was braver than I'll ever be." Claire nodded once, then walked away, her silhouette framed by the golden light of morning. He watched her go, every step a reminder that redemption didn't come from verdicts. It came from choosing to face what you'd buried. When she disappeared around the corner, Robert Langford stood alone in the courtyard. The church bells began to ring again, their notes deep and clear over the hum of the city. He looked toward the distant spire of St. Andrew's and whispered, "I'll see you tonight." The evening sky above Savannah had turned a soft rose gray, the kind of twilight that blurred the edges of buildings and made everything appear closer than it really was. The Church of St. Andrew's stood quiet beneath the moss-hung oaks, its stained glass windows glowing faintly as candles flickered within. The smell of wax and rain mixed in the air, gentle cleansing. Claire arrived early, as she often did when she wasn't sure she wanted to stay. The wooden doors creaked as she pushed them open, and the cool breath of the sanctuary met her like a sigh. She dipped her fingers in the basin of holy water, not out of habit, but out of the need to do something with her shaking hands. Only a few parishioners were scattered among the pews, elderly couples, a young mother with her toddler, a man lighting candles near the altar. Claire slipped into a pew halfway down the aisle. Her belly had begun to round now, small but undeniable beneath her loose coat. The child inside kicked once, a quiet reminder that life was still moving forward whether she was ready or not. She looked toward the altar where the crucifix hung, its wood dark with age. Her mother used to bring her here on Thursday evenings to light a candle and whisper prayers Claire never quite understood. For strength, her mother would say, and for mercy when strength runs out. Now, alone in that same space, Claire lit her own candle. The tiny flame wavered, catching on a draft from the old windows. She whispered, "For her, for me, for whatever comes next." A movement near the back of the church drew her eyes. Judge Langford had entered quietly, hat in hand, the same black coat he had worn in court still neatly pressed. For a moment he stood near the door as though unsure if he belonged. Then slowly he made his way down the aisle and sat 2 pews behind her. The silence between them stretched. Claire didn't turn around, but she felt his presence heavy, watchful, and yet strangely fragile. The priest's voice rose at the front, warm and steady. "Mercy is not the absence of justice," he said, "but its completion." The words seemed to hang in the candlelight, hovering just between them. When the service ended, the parishioners began to file out, murmuring goodnights and blessing themselves. Claire remained seated. So did he. Only when the last footsteps faded did she speak. "You came." Langford's answer was quiet. "You asked me to. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I should." She turned then, meeting his eyes for the first time since that morning. They were tired, lined with something that looked almost like fear. "It's strange," she said softly. "I've spent my life wondering who my father was. And now that I know, I can't decide what hurts more, the not knowing or the knowing." He took a breath. "Both can hurt the same way." She looked at the candle still burning in front of her. "My mother used to light one here every week. I never asked for what. For you," he said. "And maybe for me too." Her voice trembled. "Then I guess it worked. We both found our way back." Langford lowered his head. "I wish she could see you now. I do too." She brushed a tear away before it could fall. "But maybe she does." For a long while neither spoke. The last of the candles guttered in the draft, their wax pooling like melted gold. Outside, the bells of St. Andrew's began to toll the hours, slow, measured, forgiving. And in that echoing sanctuary, 2 people who had once been strangers sat side by side, learning the first fragile shape of peace. They sat for several minutes in the quiet that followed the echo of the church bells still trembling through the air. The light from the altar spilled across the pews in soft amber pools. Claire finally drew a deep breath, her fingers laced tightly together on her lap. "When I was little," she said, not looking at him, "I used to imagine my father was someone far away, maybe a sailor or a writer or a man who just got lost. My mother never told me otherwise. She used to smile when I asked. It was the one thing she wouldn't explain." Langford's gaze dropped to the worn wood of the pew before him. "She was protecting you, or protecting herself." Claire's voice wasn't bitter, just tired. "I thought maybe she was ashamed of me. Now I know she was just trying to spare me from your absence." He bowed his head. "There's no defense for what I did. There's only the truth. And the truth is, I was weak." She turned toward him, then really looking at him, the way his hands trembled slightly when he clasped them, the faint tremor in his jaw, when he tried to hold himself steady. He wasn't the unshakable figure she'd once seen on the bench. He was just a man undone by what he'd lost. "My mother used to say weakness wasn't failing," Claire murmured. "It was refusing to learn from it." Langford smiled, faintly, eyes glistening. Then she was right again. A faint laugh escaped her. She usually was. The church was nearly empty now. The last of the candles burned low, their light trembling, as if unsure whether to hold on or surrender to the dark. Claire stood slowly, pressing one hand against her side as the baby stirred. He noticed. "How far along are you?" 7 months, she said softly. "The doctor says everything looks good." Langford's eyes softened. A child. The word came out half awe, half prayer. "Another beginning," maybe she said, "if I don't ruin it before it starts." He shook his head. "You won't. You've already done something I never could stayed." Her throat tightened. "That's not strength. That's fear. I don't want this baby to grow up wondering who they are." "Then they won't," he said. "You'll make sure of it. You already are." The words landed between them soft and steady. For the first time, Claire didn't feel like she was standing in the shadow of the past. She felt it beside her, heavy but no longer unbearable. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall again, tapping lightly against the stained glass. Langford rose, moving to stand beside her. "Let me walk you to your car," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. Together they stepped out into the night. The rain had turned the streets into mirrors, and the reflection of the church glimmered on the wet pavement like a memory they could finally face. As they reached her car, Claire paused with her hand on the door. "You know this doesn't fix anything," she said quietly. "It doesn't make it right." "No," Langford agreed, "but it makes it possible." She looked at him, then the lines of his face caught in the streetlight, older, gentler, human. "Maybe that's enough for tonight." He nodded once, voice rough. "For tonight, it's everything." Claire slipped into the car, and for a moment they just looked at each other through the glass. Then, she started the engine. The headlights flared, washing him in pale light. He lifted a hand, not as a judge, not as a man seeking forgiveness, but simply as a father saying goodbye. She returned the gesture, a faint, almost imperceptible wave, and drove off into the rain. Langford stood alone in the empty street until her taillights disappeared around the corner. Then, beneath the whispering oaks of Savannah, he whispered to no one and to everyone at once, "Thank you for giving me this chance." The rain answered softly, steady and endless, like grace itself. The morning rain came without warning. Soft at first, then swelling into a steady downpour that turned the streets of Savannah into shifting mirrors. It blurred the pastel houses, the cafe awnings, the trolley bells, until the city seemed half asleep, dreaming under the weight of water. Inside her small apartment above Whitaker Street, Claire stood by the window, wrapped in one of her mother's old cardigans. The air smelled of coffee and rain and a little lavender from the candle she had lit hours ago. Her belly had grown rounder now, 7 months, the doctor said, and every time she caught her reflection it startled her, the quiet evidence of life pushing forward, even when she felt stuck. The storm reminded her of Charleston, of nights when her mother would hum through the thunder, saying storms were proof that heaven was still listening. But this morning, heaven felt distant, and the world too close. Her phone buzzed against the table. 3 messages from Linda Graves. Claire swiped through them quickly, routine notes about paperwork, follow-up calls, until the last one made her heart stutter. Linda, breaking news. Coal Industries under investigation, multiple witnesses, DA reopened case. For a long moment she just stared at the screen, unable to move. The name burned there like an old scar, reopened Ethan Cole. The man who had once promised to build her future, then crushed it without looking back. The man who had smiled as he lied under oath. She turned on the television. The local anchor's voice was calm, rehearsed. Authorities confirmed late last night that Ethan Cole is cooperating with prosecutors following new testimonies from former employees. Sources say he may face additional charges related to prior misconduct. Claire muted the volume and sat down, trembling slightly. Cooperating. That word didn't fit him. Ethan never cooperated with anything unless it served him. And yet for the first time, he couldn't buy silence. The world was finally speaking for itself. She pressed a hand to her chest, but instead of triumph, she felt only a strange emptiness, a soft grief for all the months she'd spent waiting for this moment, imagining it would fix something. But justice, she realized, didn't heal. It only stopped the bleeding. A knock at the door pulled her back. She froze, wiping her eyes quickly before opening it. Judge Robert Langford stood in the hallway, raincoat dark with water hat in hand. His gray eyes, so much like her own, were steady but unsure. "I heard the news," he said quietly. "May I come in?" She nodded. "Of course." He stepped inside, brushing rain from his coat. The room felt suddenly smaller, filled with the smell of wet wool and cold air. He looked around slowly, noticing the books stacked neatly on the table, the framed photo of Claire's mother on the mantel, the soft quilt draped over the couch. "You've made this place feel like home," he said. "Some days it is," she murmured. "Some days it's just somewhere to hide." He smiled faintly, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "I know that feeling." Claire motioned for him to sit while she poured 2 cups of coffee. The quiet between them was thick, but not uncomfortable, like 2 people standing at the edge of something fragile but necessary. When she returned, he was staring out the window, watching the rain run down the glass. "I remember nights like this," he said softly, "when your mother would sit in that little apartment we shared in Charleston, reading by candlelight. I used to think the world couldn't touch her when she was in that glow." Claire set his coffee down carefully. "She never told me much about you," she said, "only that you were brave once, and then you weren't." Langford's face tightened. "That sounds right. She said she forgave you." He looked at her, startled. "She did?" Claire nodded, in her way. "She said, some men lose their courage once and spend the rest of their lives trying to find it again." I didn't know what she meant until now. He swallowed hard. Then she saw more in me than I deserved. Claire studied him quietly. The man sitting before her was not the imposing figure from the courtroom. He was smaller somehow. Tired, real. She realized with a flicker of tenderness that he had probably practiced this visit in his head a dozen times, just as she had rehearsed every question she would ask. And yet when the moment came, words were useless. "I didn't know if you'd come," she said. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "But I didn't want you to face this alone." "I've faced worse," she said, a hint of steel in her voice. He nodded. "I know, but you shouldn't have had to." The rain eased to a soft patter, and for the first time Claire noticed how quiet the world outside had become. She wrapped her hands around her cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "Ethan turning himself in, it doesn't fix anything," she said. "It won't give back what I lost," no, Langford said, "but it gives you back something else." "What choice?" She looked up, puzzled. He continued. "For the first time, you can choose what comes next, not what someone else decided for you. That's what justice should leave behind, not punishment, but freedom." His words sank in slowly, like rain soaking through soil. She wanted to argue, to say freedom didn't erase pain, but instead she just nodded. "You talk like a man who's been waiting to say that for a long time." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I've been waiting for the right person to hear it." They sat together for a while, the silence now softer, broken only by the sound of water dripping from the eaves. Claire felt something stir inside her, a feeling both terrifying and tender. She wasn't ready to call it peace, but it was close enough to recognize. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "Do you ever stop being afraid?" Langford thought for a long moment before answering. "No, you just stop letting fear choose for you." Claire's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back. "Then maybe that's the lesson." He nodded. "It's one I wish I'd learned sooner." The baby kicked softly under her ribs, as if to remind her that sooner didn't matter anymore, only now. She pressed her palm to her belly, smiling through the ache. Langford watched her, his expression tender. "He's going to have your strength," he said. "Or your stubbornness," she said, a small laugh escaping. He chuckled, the sound deep and unfamiliar. Then, "God help us both." For the first time, the space between them didn't feel broken. It felt like a bridge, new, fragile, but holding. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Light pressed gently through the thinning clouds, painting their faces in muted gold. Claire leaned back, her voice no more than a whisper. Maybe this storm was the last one. Langford glanced toward the window. "Storms never end, Claire, but they do pass," and as the city exhaled beneath the clearing sky, father and daughter sat in the soft aftermath, quietly learning what it meant to begin again. The rain had stopped by late afternoon, leaving the city washed clean, the air heavy with that sharp scent of wet pavement and magnolia. From the apartment window, the streets below shimmered like silver ribbons beneath a pale sky. Claire watched them for a long time before she spoke. "Do you think he'll actually pay for what he did?" she asked quietly. Langford, who sat across from her at the small kitchen table, turned the empty coffee cup in his hands. "Ethan Cole." She nodded. "There's enough evidence now to make him answer for it," he said. "But justice, real justice, won't come from the court. It'll come from what you do with the piece that follows." She tilted her head, half smiling. "That sounds like something you used to tell your juries." He smiled, but it was sad. "I suppose it does. Maybe it's what I've been trying to tell myself all along." They sat quietly as the sun slipped lower, staining the room in gold. Claire got up and started clearing the cups, more to steady her nerves than to clean. He stood to help her, and together they moved in a small rhythm that felt almost domestic, passing plates, drying hands, small gestures that filled the silence better than words. When the last dish was set aside, Claire leaned against the counter. "You don't have to keep checking on me," she said gently. "I'll be all right." Langford folded the dish towel neatly. "I know, but I also know what loneliness sounds like." She turned toward him, eyes narrowing slightly. "And what does it sound like?" He met her gaze. Silence that pretends it's peace. The words hung between them. Claire looked down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I used to think I was strong because I could survive alone." "You are strong," he said, "but strength isn't just endurance. Sometimes it's the courage to let someone stay." Her breath caught a little, as though something inside her had been waiting to hear that. "I'm not sure I know how to do that." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I'm learning." The tenderness in his voice startled her. She turned away, staring out the window again. The clouds had begun to part, and a sliver of late sunlight touched the rooftops across the square. It reminded her of her mother's voice. "Storms always leave something behind if you look for it." She rested a hand on her belly, the baby shifting beneath her palm. "He's quiet now," she murmured. "Maybe the calm after the storm." Langford smiled faintly. "He takes after you." There was another pause, long, soft, filled with the faint hum of traffic and the ticking of the kitchen clock. Claire spoke again, her tone hesitant. "When this is all over, when Ethan's case is done, when the baby comes, what happens then? Do we just go back to being strangers who know too much about each other?" Langford took a slow breath. "That depends on what you want, Claire." She turned, studying him. The lines around his mouth deepened when he was nervous. His shoulders, once rigid, now carried the weight of gentleness instead of authority. "I don't know what I want," she admitted, "but I know I don't want to hate you anymore." He nodded, his voice low. "That's more than I ever hoped for." She gave a small laugh, shaky but real. "Don't thank me yet. I might change my mind tomorrow." He smiled. "Then I'll be here tomorrow too." That made her look up sharply, but there was no expectation in his eyes, only quiet certainty. And for the first time, she realized he wasn't asking for forgiveness anymore. He was simply showing up one ordinary moment at a time. The last of the light faded. Claire reached for the switch by the door, bathing the room in a soft amber glow. "Would you stay for dinner?" she asked, surprising herself as much as him. "It's nothing fancy, just soup and bread." Langford blinked, then nodded slowly. "I'd like that." They ate at the small table by the window. Conversation came in fragments, stories of her mother, of his early years in Charleston, of little things they'd both forgotten how to share. Outside, the city's lights flickered on, one by one, reflections, stretching across the wet street like a constellation drawn from ordinary lives. When they finished, Claire carried the dishes to the sink, humming softly under her breath. Langford watched her, the corners of his mouth lifting in quiet wonder. He hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since a house had felt like home. Before he left, she walked him to the door. The rain had begun again, light and steady. He reached for his coat, then hesitated. "I'll check in with you tomorrow," he said. "Not because I have to, because I want to." She nodded, hand on the door. "Good night, Robert." It was the first time she had said his name without hesitation. He smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "Good night, Claire." He stepped out into the rain, pulling his collar up against the chill. She stood in the doorway, watching him go, the streetlight glinting off the puddles like small pieces of glass. When he turned the corner and disappeared, She closed the door slowly and leaned against it, exhaling a long, trembling breath. Her apartment felt different now. Not bigger, but warmer. She went to the window, rested her palm against the glass, and whispered to the dark, "We're getting there, Mom. We really are." The rain answered softly like a lullaby against the roof, steady and certain, promising that the storm had finally begun to fade. The storm had passed, leaving Savannah wrapped in a quiet, golden calm. The streets glistened with the memory of rain, and sunlight spilled through the branches like slow honey. From her small apartment window, Claire watched the city wake vendors setting up carts, church bells echoing faintly over the river, and a pair of sparrows flitting across the railing. For the first time in weeks, she felt rested. No nightmares, no courtroom flashbacks, just the gentle rhythm of her breathing and the faint flutter of life inside her belly. She pressed a hand to it, whispering, "We made it." A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Robert Langford stood there, a little unsure, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. His suit was pressed, but his eyes were soft, the look of a man who'd rehearsed this visit 1,000 times. "Good morning," he said quietly. "I hope I'm not too early." Claire smiled faintly. "It's fine. I was just making coffee." He hesitated a moment before stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and soap. A framed photograph of Laura Whitmore rested on the shelf by the window, her mother's smile bright beneath the sunlight. Robert's gaze lingered there a moment longer than he meant to. "She'd have loved this place," he murmured. Claire poured 2 cups and motioned for him to sit. "It's small," she said, "but it feels like her somehow. I think that's why I stayed." He nodded, setting the box gently on the table between them. "I found this yesterday." Or maybe it found me. She untied the string and opened it. Inside lay a small silver locket worn smooth from time. When she opened it, 2 photos stared back, Laura's smiling face and a baby's bright eyes. On the inside, clasped, a tiny engraving read, "Forgive me not for yesterday, but for today." Claire's breath caught. "It's hers." "Yes," Robert said softly. "She gave it to Linda years ago. Told her to keep it safe until the right time came. I suppose that time is now." Claire's eyes shimmered with tears she didn't try to hide. "I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to," he said. "Just wear it. Let it remind you that love doesn't vanish. It waits." They sat for a moment in stillness, sunlight pouring over the table like blessing. The city beyond the window hummed with gentle life, but inside that room, time seemed to slow, holding space for something fragile and new understanding. The light in the room deepened to a soft amber, touching the edges of the table, and the locket resting in Claire's hand. She traced her mother's face in the tiny photo, the metal warm from her touch. Robert sipped his coffee quietly, unsure whether to speak. Finally, she looked up and broke the silence. "Ethan turned himself in," she said. "The district attorney called this morning." He nodded. "I heard. Justice doesn't always arrive quickly, but it always finds its way." Claire exhaled slowly, her shoulders loosening. "For the first time, I don't feel like a victim. I just feel done. Free." Robert smiled, his eyes soft with pride. "You've found your own verdict." A faint laugh escaped her. "That sounds like something a judge would say." "Maybe," he replied gently, "but this time I'm just your father." She looked at him, really looked past the years, past the fear, and saw a man who had finally learned how to stay. "Then stay for breakfast," she said. "I think Mom would like that." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'd be honored." They ate in the quiet rhythm of morning, the sound of cutlery soft, the scent of toast and coffee filling the room. When they finished, Robert stood by the window and looked out at the bright, washed streets. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have again," he said softly. Claire tilted her head. "What's that?" "Another morning worth waking up for." She smiled and reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "Then don't waste it, Dad." The word landed gently between them like sunlight through the window. Simple, warm, and true. He nodded, emotion catching in his throat. "I won't." As he left, Claire stood at the window and watched him walk down the street beneath the arching oaks. The city shimmered around him, new, clean, forgiving. She touched the locket at her neck, whispering to the quiet morning, "We're all right now, Mom." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The morning after the rain. Savannah awoke to a sky rinsed clean, soft gold light spilling across the cobblestones, magnolias trembling in the breeze. In that gentle hush of a new day, Claire stood by the window with her newborn son in her arms, watching the world return to color. Down the street, Robert Langford walked slowly toward her door, holding a small bouquet of white lilies, the same kind her mother once loved. Their eyes met through the glass, and for a quiet heartbeat, everything that had once been broken finally found a shape that could hold love again. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was an honest one, a story stitched from sorrow and forgiveness, from words left unsaid and second chances finally taken. There were no grand gestures, no thunder of justice, only two people learning that healing sometimes sounds like morning coffee being poured, or a baby breathing softly in the crook of your arm. The judge no longer needed his bench to feel purpose, and the daughter no longer needed to hide from her reflection. Both had surrendered their pasts to the quiet truth of what remained family rebuilt not from blood alone, but from courage and grace. If you listen closely, you can still hear their story in the rhythm of everyday kindness. The neighbor who checks in on you when it rains, the hand that steadies yours when the world feels too heavy. Because in the end, redemption doesn't arrive like a verdict. It unfolds slowly in the patience to forgive and the humility to begin again. Love, it turns out, isn't loud or flawless. It's the gentle persistence of showing up even when you've failed before. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Unconditional love can change the shape of a life. Everyone deserves a chance to be loved and to belong. Kindness, more than money or position, remains the truest measure of a life well lived. And happiness, real happiness, comes quietly the moment we stop trying to win at life and start trying to care. It's like the porch light you leave on at night just in case someone you love is still finding their way home. You may never know who it guides or how far its glow reaches, but sometimes that single act of faith is enough to bring light to the darkest street. So tonight, when you sit down at your own dinner table, maybe with a cup of coffee cooling beside you or your favorite song playing low, remember that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's proof that the heart, no matter how weathered by time, still knows how to open. If this story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments to let me know it found you. And if you think it could be told better, press 0 and share your thoughts, because stories like this one live longer when they remind us that we're all still learning to love, to heal, and to start again.